Although the independence movements in 20th century Asia and Africa certainly had some things in common, there are also many differences between the different movements. So in the previous section, I just wanted to give you a broad overview of some of the themes of decolonization, some of the broad similarities. Here I just want to give you a quick snapshot of some of the independence movements that you should be at least a little bit familiar with when it comes to the AP exam. So, like I mentioned in the previous sections, nationalist movements were always led by the minority of local people who were privileged in life. And the most successful of these nationalist leaders became the fathers of their new countries. Some of the examples of these fathers of independence include Mahatma Gandhi in India, Jomo Kenyatta in Kenya, Nelson Mandela in South Africa, Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam, and Kwame Nkrumah in the Gold Coast, later Ghana. These nationalist leaders were able to capture the imaginations and supports of millions of regular people and inspired people to fight for their country's independence. And for the most part, people had to fight for independence. It wasn't automatic. Some places it happened faster than other places, some places it happened more peacefully than other places, but it was always a contested process. The independence movements in sub-Saharan Africa were led by a small minority of Africans who had received a European or American education. The first African nation to gain independence was the Gold Coast in 1957, and this country would later become known as Ghana after the ancient West African kingdom. The independence movement in Ghana was led by Kwame Nkrumah, who was educated in the United States. Nkrumah organized worker strikes and protests in the Gold Coast and was able to convince the British that they shouldn't be there anymore. Independence in Kenya was harder to come by. Kenya was also a British colony. One of the major differences between Kenya and the Gold Coast was that there was a large British population living in Kenya. So independence required an armed revolt, and eventually Kenya was able to achieve independence in 1963 under the leadership of Jomo Kenyatta. In some African countries, the legacy left by European rule made independence very difficult. This is true in the Belgian colonies of the Congo and Rwanda. One thing that you want to bear in mind when considering these new emerging African nations is that their borders were really arbitrarily drawn by European powers during the scramble for Africa. And often these artificial divisions put multiple ethnic groups into one colony. And sometimes these were people that had been traditional enemies. An example of this is in Rwanda. It was a colony of Belgium. And Rwanda was made up of two main ethnic groups. The majority of people are Hutu, and the minority are Tutsi. When the Belgians were in power, they favored the Tutsis and gave the Tutsis better jobs in their administration. When Belgium left, there was a lot of hatred between the Tutsis and the Hutu. But these two people are living within the same country. Ultimately, it leads to civil war and genocide in the 1990s. And a similar thing happened in the Belgian Congo. Remember, the Belgian rule of the Congo was extremely brutal, especially between 1885 and 1908 when King Leopold II ruled the colony directly. People were massacred if they didn't collect enough rubber, so very horrible regime. And by 1959, the Belgians had really lost control of the country. The Congo was on the brink of civil war, and the Belgians just pulled out and allowed their former colony to really descend into civil war. During the 19th and 20th century, much of Southeast Asia was under the control of France, and both France and the French colonies in Southeast Asia were occupied by Axis powers during World War II. France was occupied by the German Nazis, and the French colonies in Southeast Asia were occupied by the Japanese. A group of Vietnamese nationalists under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh fought off the Japanese during World War II. After World War II, the French, fresh off being liberated from Nazi rule, decided that they should go back and try to conquer their Asian colonies again. So obviously, they didn't really learn a lesson from being occupied by the Nazis. Now, the leader, Ho Chi Minh, was educated in France, and while in France, he came under the influence of the ideas of Karl Marx. But at the same time, Ho Chi Minh really admired the American Revolution and the ideas of Thomas Jefferson. So Ho Chi Minh wanted an independent nation of Vietnam, and he studied the Declaration of Independence, he studied the ideas of Karl Marx, and he was sure that the United States were going to be his allies and support his efforts to create an independent Vietnam. Now, the first stage of Vietnam's struggle for independence was a brutal 9-year war between the Vietnamese nationalists and the French, and it ended in the eventual defeat of the French. So after the Vietnamese nationalists beat the French invaders, world powers got together in Geneva, Switzerland to decide what would happen with Vietnam. And it was decided in Geneva that Vietnam would be split into two countries, like Korea had and like Germany had. North Vietnam would come under control of the nationalists. A separate government, supported by the United States, would run in the south. And in a few years, there would be elections to unify Vietnam. So this is the context of the Cold War. On one side, you have the communist North, and on the other side, you have the American-backed South. Now, the problem for the Americans was that A, Ho Chi Minh was a socialist, which was unacceptable to the United States, and B, he was a national hero. And what this meant was that if elections took place, Ho Chi Minh would have easily won, and Vietnam would have democratically elected a socialist government. So the United States tries to stall the elections, and they end up intervening militarily. It's a terrible war, ultimately winding up with North Vietnamese victory and the unification of a communist Vietnam. The end of the war doesn't happen until after Ho Chi Minh has passed away.